All right, Biology 30s. We are continuing on in our Chapter 11 Nervous System Notes Guide. This is video 2. Here, I want to talk about the different cells of the nervous system. So the basic cell is called a neuron. And obviously, you know, it's a nervous system. We have nerves, and the neurons are organized into nerves. So the three types of neurons that you have to know about are the sensory neurons, the interneurons, and the motor neurons. Not only do you need to know what they do, but you're going to have to be able to draw and label these out and know the different parts of the neuron and what it does, its function. There's supporting cells as well, and these supporting cells help for nourishing the neurons, and they're not conducting, they're not going to transmit nerve impulses. And there are different ones depending on whether you're in the PNS, the peripheral nervous system, or in the CNS. So on our next page, it goes through, and this is from table 11.1 in your textbook, and it goes through the different types of neurons that you have to have memorized. So the different types of neurons include the sensory receptors that are going to be stimulated by something in the environment. So for instance, when we're watching this video, the photoreceptors in our eyes, our sense organs called our eyes, are going to be stimulated, and that's how we see things, okay? And so that sensory information then goes to a sensory or afferent neuron, and it takes nerve impulses, action potentials, they're also called, from these sensory receptors to the CNS, to the interneurons that are found there. So again, we've already learned about sensory versus motor. Sensory is going to the CNS, and motor is going away from the CNS. So we can jump down to the sensory neurons. You can look at the motor neurons, and the motor neurons are going to conduct impulses away from the CNS. So then what is in the CNS? That's the connector between the sensory and the motor. That would be the interneurons, or the association neurons. They're in between the sensory and motor. So they're found entirely within the CNS, the brain and the spinal cord, and they help with integrating and processing the information coming from the sensory and going to the motor or efferent. Then the motor neurons transmit these nerve impulses or action potentials away from the CNS to where? Well, to the effectors. And the effectors are the muscles and the glands that are going to respond to the impulses. They cause us to have movement, or makes a gland secrete a hormone inside of our body. Okay, so sensory goes to the CNS and motor is going away from the CNS. So now you guys have to be able to draw and label a sensory neuron. And so I'm just getting this ready. So when you are drawing, there's two different types of neurons. You don't have to worry about the interneurons. We're just going to strictly focus on a sensory neuron. So I always start with a straight line. That's the best straight line I can do. And then we're going to draw the cell body. And the cell body has inside of it the neuron. You can see there the neuron. And there's always two ends to a neuron. There is the receiving end, and that's where the dendrites are. And so I'm drawing those little dendrites. And then at the other end is where the axon terminals are. And I'm just putting little bulbs at the end of them. Okay, and so here's the basics of our sensory neuron. You notice the cell body is in the middle. The motor neuron is a little different because the cell body is at one end. So here's the cell body, and then here's this long extension of cytoplasm called an axon, and we see that the axon terminals are going to be way down here at the other end. Now, the motor neuron actually has the dendrites associated right onto it. So this is the receiving end here, the dendrites, and of course here's where the nucleus is. So this is the receiving end. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of the neuron. But if you are a neuron that is found in the peripheral nervous system, you have a special cell called a Schwann cell that is going to wrap around the axon and create a fatty coating. It's made of fat, and it creates what is called a myelin sheath. And so these little myelin sheaths that I'm drawing in now are little sections that are wrapped around the axon, and they act to insulate against charge loss. And by doing this, they're going to increase the speed of the nerve impulse transmission. Okay, so now that we've got our sensory neuron and our motor neuron, and again, you've got to know the differences between them. Now you need to label these as well. Okay, so labeling our sensory neuron. Label means you are adding in the labels, like the words that tell you what the different structures are. Okay, for some reason that didn't work. Okay, so we've got the cell body. So where is it? Well, we write either an arrow or a little stick that is going to point to it. So it's pointing to the cell body. Where is it on the motor neuron? That's this guy here. Okay, where is the axon? Now, don't forget the axon terminals here are part of the axon as well. And so this entire length here is going to be called the axon. And now think about the word terminals. Terminal, like an airport terminal, that's the very end of the airport. So the terminals are the endings, the axon endings. And so these axon terminals are at the very end of the axon. Now I've written this guy in the other direction, right? And so here's the axon and here's the axon terminals. So we have to label them. We are going to add in what is the label, and then we write either a stick or an arrow that points to it. And remember that the axon starts all the way on our motor neuron here from the cell body. So it's this entire extension here, and it includes the axon terminals, right? This would be like, you've got to make sure to keep those axon terminals in your label. It'd be like labeling your arm without having your hand on it, right? It's all part of that same extension. And then, as I mentioned, we have these dendrites, and these are receiving stimuli from receptors or other neurons. And so here are the dendrites, and they are going to take the nerve impulses, the action potentials, towards the cell body. So we also have, as I mentioned, this fatty insulating layer, which we call the myelin sheath. So let's label the myelin sheath. So there's our myelin sheath there. And here he is here and here, right? It's this stuff that covers over the axon. It's acting to increase the speed of nerve impulse transmission, and that is our myelin or our myelin sheath. So we've got a bunch of new vocabulary here. Myelin or myelin sheath is covering over the axon. But as you can see, there are little bare spots that are still at the axon. And these little bare spots here that are not covered by myelin have sodium and potassium channels that are going to help to form the nerve impulse. And these little bare spots that are not insulated, these are called the nodes of Ranvier. And so what happens is that the action potential actually can jump over the myelin from node to node to node to node. And you can see how that would increase the speed of the nerve impulse transmission. Okay, and so here again is our nodes of, nodes of Ranvier. Okay, so named after some famous dead guy. All right, so there's the basic parts of a sensory neuron and a motor neuron. Okay, we're going to talk about what is each of the function of them. I kind of mentioned that already, but I'll go into more detail in our next video. Okay, that's it for video number 2 in the series.